The first thing Eli Crow saw that winter morning was smoke curling where no smoke ought to be, thin as a ghost's finger rising from the chimney of his cabin, and he reined his horse hard, heart thumping like hooves on frozen ground, because no one came up this far unless they were lost, desperate, or running from something meaner than the mountains. The wind cut his face raw, the sky hung low and white, and in that breath of fear he knew his quiet life had just been split open. Eli had built that cabin with his own hands 10 years back, after the range wars and the graves they left behind, after the town had taken more than it gave. He wanted a place where the world could not reach him. Pine logs stacked tight, a stone hearth, one narrow window facing the creek, no road, no neighbors, just elk tracks and the long howl of night. He came up here to forget faces and names, to let days pass like slow cattle. And now someone was inside, breathing his air, warming their hands at his fire. He dismounted slow, fingers brushing the worn grip of his revolver, not eager for blood, but not foolish either. The door stood closed, latched the way he always left it, which told him this stranger knew how to survive, knew how to respect a place even while trespassing. Eli pushed the door open with his boot. The hinges groaned soft, and there she was, standing by the hearth like she had grown out of the shadows themselves. She was wrapped in his spare blanket, dark hair loose around her shoulders, eyes wide and watchful like a doe cornered by wolves. She did not scream, did not run. She just looked at him, and something in that look stopped him colder than the snow outside. Fear was there, yes, but also resolve, the kind that comes from someone who has already decided not to break. "I did not know who else to go to," she said, voice low, steady, and Eli realized he had not heard a woman's voice in months. Maybe longer. He should have asked her name right then, should have demanded answers, but instead he set his hat on the peg and shrugged out of his coat. The cold had settled into his bones, and her presence made the cabin feel smaller, warmer, alive. "You're safe for now," he said, surprising himself with the gentleness of it. He set a kettle on the fire and watched her shoulders ease just a touch, as if those few words had been a door closing on the world behind her. She told him only what she had to, that the town below had turned cruel, that eyes followed her, whispers grew teeth. She did not say why, and he did not press. Eli knew about men who hunted more eagerly than wolves, about secrets that could get a person buried in a shallow grave. The mountains kept such confidence as well, and he had chosen them for that very reason. Days passed like that, snow piling high against the walls, the trail vanishing. She stayed inside, mending a tear in his shirt, sweeping the floor, moving quiet as if afraid sound itself might betray her. Eli watched her without meaning to, the way she stood at the window at dusk, the way she flinched at sudden noise, and he felt something shifting. This cabin had been a place to hide from the world. Now it was hiding the world from her. At night he lay awake, listening to the fire crackle, and her breathing from the other side of the room, and he understood with a slow ache that he no longer saw the endless snow, or the empty sky, or the lonely stretch of years ahead. All he saw was the woman who had stepped out of the storm and into his life, and for the first time since he had ridden away from everything, the silence no longer felt like freedom. The snow eased its grip as winter leaned towards spring, but Eli felt no thaw inside him, only a tightening awareness that the woman in his cabin, whose name he had finally learned was Clara, was no passing storm. She had settled into the grain of his days. Mornings began with the sound of her stirring the fire. Evenings ended with the two of them sharing quiet meals while the mountains pressed close outside. And in that closeness, Eli began to notice how the world crept back in despite his distance. Tracks near the creek that were not elk, a broken branch where no wind had blown, the sense that the cabin was no longer invisible. Clara noticed too. Her eyes lingered on the door longer, her hands stilled when the wind carried far-off sounds, and though neither said it aloud, both knew hiding was never meant to last forever. Clara told him more then. Not all, but enough to weigh heavy. A man in town who had decided she belonged to him because he had money and friends and a voice people listened to. When she refused him, he had smiled and promised she would regret it. And soon after came the whispers, the false kindness, the doors that closed, until staying meant being crushed slow and quiet. Eli listened with his jaw tight. He knew that kind of man, had crossed paths with them back when he still believed justice could be wrestled from the dirt. He felt the old anger stir, the one he had buried beneath years of solitude, and he realized that protecting this woman meant risking the peace he had carved out with such care. The first rider appeared one afternoon while Eli was cutting wood, a distant figure moving where no one had any reason to be. Eli felt a prickle before he saw him, the sense that the mountains were holding their breath. He sent Clara inside without a word, took his rifle, and stood in plain sight, letting the stranger know he was seen. The rider turned away after a long moment, but the message was clear: the world had found them. That night, Clara did not sleep, and Eli sat by the door until dawn, knowing there was no longer any pretending this cabin was just a refuge. It had become a line drawn in the snow. Clara began to change after that. No longer only the hunted, she learned the land, walked the perimeter with Eli, learned where the creek narrowed, where the trees grew thick enough to hide. She asked about the scars on his hands, the ones he never talked about, and he found himself telling her pieces of his past, about the violence he had walked away from, about the brother he could not save. The words came rough and slow, but she listened without flinching, and in her listening he felt seen in a way that unsettled him more than any threat from outside. Trouble came with the melt. When the trails opened and the cabin could no longer disappear behind walls of white, 3 men rode up one morning, not shouting, not threatening, just smiling too easily, asking questions they already knew the answers to. Eli stood between them and the door, rifle resting, casual but ready. Clara stayed inside, but her presence was there, heavy as a heartbeat. The men spoke of law, of responsibility, of a woman who belonged back in town. Eli answered, with the land itself, with silence and the cold weight of his stare. The standoff stretched thin as wire, until the men left, promising they would return with more than words that night. Clara cried for the first time, not loud, just the quiet breaking of someone who had been holding herself together too long. Eli did not know how to fix such things, but he sat beside her, his hand awkward on her shoulder, until she leaned into him like she had been waiting to fall. In that moment he understood something simple and terrifying. If they took her, there would be nothing left of the life he had built. She was no longer just someone he sheltered. She was the center of his sight, the measure by which everything else faded. They planned then, not escape but standing ground. Eli knew running would only prove the men right, would keep Clara looking over her shoulder forever, so they prepared the cabin, set snares, marked paths only they knew. Clara moved with purpose now, fear sharpening into resolve, and Eli felt pride burn through him. She was not hiding anymore, she was choosing, and that choice bound them together tighter than any promise spoken aloud. As the days stretched toward the inevitable return of those riders, Eli found himself watching Clara in moments of calm, the way she laughed softly at nothing, the way she stood tall when the wind tried to bow her, and he realized the truth he had been circling since the first day he saw smoke from his chimney. The world he had fled was no longer what he feared losing. The only thing he saw, the only thing worth fighting for, was the woman who had stepped into his cabin and made it something more than a place to hide. The riders came back at dawn just as Eli had known they would. The mountains were pink with first light, and the air carried that sharp stillness that comes before violence. 4 men this time, not 3, spread wide as they approached, like they owned the land beneath their horses' hooves. Eli stood outside the cabin with the rifle resting easy in his hands, Clara watching from the window, not hiding now but standing where she could see and be seen. And in that moment Eli understood that the world had not chased her here by accident. It had come so she could finally stop running. Words were spoken, ugly ones wrapped in politeness, threats disguised as law and concern. Eli answered only when needed, his voice calm, steady, the kind that told men there would be a cost. The leader smiled the way men do when they believe fear will do the work for them, and when he stepped forward past the invisible line Eli had drawn, everything broke loose. The mountains echoed with gunfire, horses screamed, and the quiet life Eli had guarded for years shattered into smoke and sound. But even as chaos reigned, his eyes never left the cabin window where Clara stood, unflinching. The fight was fast and brutal, not heroic the way stories like to pretend, just men choosing survival. Eli moved with the land, using trees and rock, years of hard memory guiding his hands. 1 man fell, then another fled. The rest broke when they realized this was not a place they could take. When it was over, the leader lay wounded but alive, staring up at Eli with something like disbelief, the truth finally settling in that some things cannot be owned, cannot be dragged back to town by force. Clara came out then, slow and steady, her face pale but her spine straight. She stood beside Eli as he told the man to leave and never return. that the mountains remembered faces and did not forgive easily. The man crawled away to his horse, pride stripped bare, and rode off with the others, leaving silence behind, heavy and complete, the kind that only follows a storm. Afterward there was work, burying what needed burying, cleaning blood from snow, tending to the small wounds that come from living instead of hiding. Clara's hands were steady as she bound Eli's arm, her touch no longer tentative, and he realized she was no longer a guest in his cabin. She was part of its bones now, part of the reason the fire burned and the door stayed closed at night. They talked then, truly talked, about what came next, about whether staying meant danger or freedom, and Clara surprised him by saying she wanted to remain, not because she was afraid to leave, but because she had found herself here, in the hard quiet, in the choice to stand. Eli felt something settle deep in his chest, the restless ache he had carried for years easing at last. This cabin had been built to shut the world out, but now it stood because two people had chosen it together. Summer came gentle that year. The creek ran clear, the mountains green and open, and though Eli still noticed tracks and distant riders, fear no longer ruled the space between breaths. Clara walked the land like it belonged to her, laughed loud now, planted flowers by the cabin wall, and Eli watched her with the same wonder he once reserved for wide skies, realizing the world he thought he needed to escape had narrowed into something far more precious in the end. Eli understood the truth the mountains had been waiting to teach him. You can hide from the world only so long before something worth seeing steps into your life. Clara had hidden in his cabin to survive, but in doing so she had stripped his solitude bare, and where there had once been nothing but distance and silence, there was now purpose, partnership, and a home. She had become the only thing he saw, not because the world was gone, but because he no longer needed it to feel whole.